Next, excuse me, please excuse me, he was dead. A gate had crushed him. There we stood, afraid. Now, in this line, the phrase excuse me, please excuse me repeats for emphasis. It shows the speaker's shock and disbelief. The repetition mimics how someone might stammer in a moment of panic, making the reaction feel realistic and emotionally charged. We know that repetition is a literary device that repeats for emphasis. Next, in this line, the phrase "a gate had crushed him" is an example of imagery because the description creates a vivid and horrifying image of a man's death. It forces the reader to picture the brutal nature of the scene, emphasizing the chaos and destruction around the characters. Next, a house standing before us tilted, swayed, toppled and crashed. Now, in this line, the words tilted, swayed, toppled and crashed vividly describe the movement of the collapsing house. Therefore, these are examples of imagery. Now, these verbs create a clear picture of the destruction, making the scene feel dynamic and intense. This line is an example of personification because the house is described as if it is alive, tilting and swaying like a person about to lose balance. This gives the scene a dramatic effect, making the house's fall seem almost deliberate or inevitable. Now, in this line, the repetition of T sounds in the words tilted and toppled create a rhythmic flow that mirrors the sequence of the house's collapse. It emphasizes the chain of events and draws attention to the destruction. Next, in this line, the word crashed mimics the sound of the house hitting the ground. This helps the reader imagine the noise and the chaos of the moment. Next, fire sprang up in the dust spread by the wind. In this line, the word fire is described as springing up, which gives it a human-like action, making it feel alive and active. Therefore, we may say that it is an example of personification. Now, the description of the fire in the dust spreading with the wind creates a clear and vivid picture in the reader's mind. Therefore, it is an example of imagery. Now, the repetition of the S sound in sprang and spread adds a smooth flowing rhythm. Therefore, we may say that it is an example of alliteration. Now, in this line, fire is an example of symbolism because fire symbolizes destruction, danger or sudden chaos depending on the context. Now, in the same line, the phrase "it dawned on us" signifies a moment of realization. Therefore, it is an example of epiphany. And we know that epiphany is a literary device that refers to a sudden, deep realization or understanding of something, often leading to a new perspective. This shows how, amidst the chaos, the characters come to understand the necessity of seeking help, adding a sense of clarity to their panic. Next, it dawned on us we must get to the hospital. We needed aid. Now, in this line, the phrase "get to the hospital" paints a clear picture of the speaker and Yeko-san's desperation to find help. Therefore, it is an example of imagery. Now, it emphasizes the urgency of their situation as they realize that they are seriously injured and they need medical attention. Now, in the same line, the phrase "it dawned on us" signifies a moment of realization. Therefore, it is an example of epiphany. And we know that epiphany is a literary device that refers to a sudden, deep realization or understanding of something, often leading to a new perspective. This shows how, amidst the chaos, the characters come to understand the necessity of seeking help, adding a sense of clarity to their panic. Next, in the same line, the phrase "we needed aid" evokes sympathy from the reader. It highlights the vulnerability of the characters and the life-threatening nature of their injuries, making the reader feel the urgency or the importance of their need for help. Now, in the phrase "thirst seized me" gives thirst human-like qualities, as if it is an active force gripping the speaker. Therefore, it is an example of personification. This makes the sensation feel overwhelming and inescapable, emphasizing their physical suffering. Now, in the same line, the repeated sound of S in sat, seized, and thirst creates a subtle rhythm that mirrors the dragging, exhausting mood of the moment. Therefore, it is an example of alliteration. Now, in the same line, the phrase "I sat down on the ground" is an example of contrast, because here the calm act of sitting down on the ground contrasts with the violent, life-threatening chaos around them. This shift in focus to a basic need like thirst or sitting down makes the suffering feel more intimate and relatable. Now, in the same line, the word "thirst" could symbolize the broader desperation and helplessness of the speaker. Their inability to find water reflects the scarcity of resources and hope in this serious situation. My breath was short, but bit by bit my strength seemed to revive, and I got up at length. Now, in this line, the phrase "my breath was short" vividly conveys the speaker's physical weakness, making it easy to picture his struggle to recover. Therefore, it is an example of imagery. Now, this phrase "bit by bit my strength seemed to revive" paints a slow, hopeful image of gradual recovery. Now, the repetition of the B sound in "bit by bit" adds a rhythmic quality to the line. It mirrors the slow, steady effort the speaker is making to regain his strength. In the same line, the phrase "bit by bit my strength seemed to revive" is an example of symbolism. Here, the revival of strength symbolizes resilience and hope amidst devastation. It shows the speaker's determination to survive despite the serious circumstances. Now, the weakness in the phrase "my breath was short" contrasts with the growing strength in the phrase "I got up at length." This highlights the speaker's perseverance and his ability to overcome physical limitations. Next, "I was still naked, but I felt no shame." This line is an example of juxtaposition. Okay, here the contrast between naked and no shame shows how the speaker's perspective has changed. Normally, being naked might feel embarrassing, but in this moment of disaster, survival and basic needs are more important than social expectations. Now, in the same line, the word "naked" creates a stark, vulnerable image of the speaker. It emphasizes his exposure, both physically and emotionally, in the aftermath of the disaster. Now, in the same line, the word "naked" symbolizes the stripping away of material possessions and societal conventions, leaving only raw humanity and survival instincts. Therefore, we may say that the lack of shame suggests the profound impact of the disaster, where basic survival instinct overshadows everything else. Next, this thought disturbed me somewhat, till I came upon a soldier standing silently, who gave the towel round his neck to me. My legs, stiff with dried blood, rebelled. In this line, phrases like "a soldier standing silently," "the towel round his neck," and "legs stiff with dried blood" paint vivid pictures. Therefore, these are examples of imagery. Now, the description allows the reader to imagine the quiet, haunting atmosphere and the speaker's physical suffering. Now, in the same line, the repeated S sounds in soldier standing silently adds a soft, almost eerie rhythm that reflects the solemn and subdued mood of the encounter. Therefore, it is an example of alliteration. Now, in the same line, the repeated S sounds in soldier standing silently adds a soft, almost eerie rhythm that reflects the solemn and subdued mood of the encounter. Therefore, it is an example of alliteration. Next, I said to Yeko-san, she must go on ahead. She did not wish to, but in our distress, what choice had we? Now, in this line, the phrase I said to Yeko-san, she must go on ahead is an example of a direct speech. Therefore, we can say that it is a dialogue. Okay, and this phrase adds a sense of acting upon the situation without any further delay. Alright, now this phrase also reflects the speaker's concern for her safety and decision making under pressure. Therefore, it makes the scene feel more personal. Now, in this line, the phrase she did not wish to evokes a sense of helplessness and sorrow. Therefore, it is an example of pathos. Okay, now here the speaker's insistence and Yeko-san's reluctance to go highlight their emotional struggle as they are forced to separate in a moment of crisis. Here, the question, what choice had we, emphasizes the inevitability of their decision. It also reflects their lack of options and therefore adds a sense of resignation to the tone by making the situation feel even more serious. Now, in this line, the phrase she did not wish to is an example of both internal and external conflict. Okay, and we know that conflict is a literary device that refers to the problem or struggle that characters face in a story or in the poem. Now, conflict is what makes the story interesting and keeps it moving. Here, Yeko-san does not want to leave, but the speaker requests her to focus on her survival. Right? Now, this tension illustrates the emotional weight of their decision. Next, a dreadful loneliness came over me when she had gone. Now, here in this line, the phrase a dreadful loneliness came over me is an example of personification because here the poet gives loneliness the human-like ability to come over someone. Okay, and as if it were a physical force that takes control. This makes the feeling of loneliness seem overwhelming and unavoidable. Now, here the phrase dreadful loneliness is an example of pathos because it evokes, as in it makes us feel a deep sense of sadness, making the reader empathize with the speaker's isolation or loneliness. Right? Now, therefore, it highlights, as in focuses, on how devastating it is to be left alone after the trauma. The phrase dreadful loneliness is an example of imagery because it paints a vivid picture of the speaker's emotional state, therefore helping the reader imagine how heavy and oppressive the loneliness feels. Next, my mind ran at high speed, my body crept behind. I saw the shadowy forms of people, some were ghosts, some scarecrows, all were wordless dumb. Now, in this line, the phrase, my mind ran at high speed, my body crept behind, is a metaphor because the speaker compares the mind to something that runs fast and the body to something that moves slowly, therefore highlighting the disconnect between their thoughts and physical state. This suggests that the speaker is mentally alert but physically too exhausted or weak. In this line, phrases like shadowy forms of people and some were ghosts, some scarecrows are examples of imagery because they create a vivid mental image of eerie, indistinct figures. This helps to convey the confusion, fear, and surreal quality of the speaker's experience. Now, in this line, the repetition of the S sound in shadowy and some creates a smooth, flowing rhythm that mirrors the slow, dreamlike quality of the scene. Therefore, it is an example of alliteration. Right? Now, it also adds to the haunting, unbelievable atmosphere. In this line, the words ghosts and scarecrows symbolize death and loss and the absence of life or hope. These figures represent the devastation and the emotional numbness that the speaker is experiencing after the disaster. Next, arms stretched straight out, shoulder to dangling hand. It took some time for me to understand the friction on their burns caused so much pain. Now, in this line, the phrase arms stretched straight out, shoulder to dangling hand is an example of imagery because it creates a vivid image of the speaker's body in pain or in shock, therefore emphasizing the unnatural position of their arms. This description helps the reader to visualize the speaker's physical state after the traumatic event. In this line, the phrase arms stretched straight out could symbolize the speaker's vulnerability and helplessness as his body is in a position of complete exposure. This could also represent a feeling of reaching out, either for help or understanding. Now, the friction on their burns caused so much pain is an example of sensory imagery because it appeals to the sense of touch. Okay, now it vividly conveys the speaker's physical suffering, allowing the reader to empathize with the intense pain that they are feeling. Next, they feared to shave flesh against flesh again. This line is an example of alliteration because the repeated F sound in flesh against flesh creates a smooth rhythm that makes the contact feel more real and uncomfortable. Now, in this line, the phrase flesh against flesh is an example of imagery because it creates a vivid image of the physical contact, focusing on the sensitivity of skin. This makes the idea of touching or moving in such a way seem painful or unpleasant, increasing the discomfort in the scene. This line is also an example of pathos because it evokes a sense of discomfort and distress, as the fear of pain becomes more significant than any physical need for interaction. Now, this adds to the emotional intensity of the scene as it reflects on the character's suffering. Next, those who could shuffled in a blank parade towards the hospital. In this line, the words shuffled and blank parade are examples of imagery because they create a vivid mental picture of people moving slowly and lifelessly, emphasizing their exhaustion and despair. Now, in this line, the phrase blank parade is an example of metaphor because here it compares the group of people to a parade, but instead of a celebration, this parade is actually empty and lifeless. This metaphor highlights their hopeless state. Next, I saw, dismayed, a woman with a child stand in my path, both naked. Had they come back from the bath? Now, in this line, the description of a woman with a child stand in my path is an example of a imagery because it vividly paints the scene of two people blocking the speaker's way. Right? Now, this also paints a clear picture and highlights the human side of the disaster, focusing more on people instead of just the damage. Right? Now, the image of a woman and the child in the aftermath of the destruction makes the disaster feel personal and very much real. In this line, the question, had they come back from the bath, is a rhetorical question because the speaker does not necessarily expect an answer. Now, it shows his confusion and disorientation at that moment. The question, although casual in tone, also reflects the unbelievable nature of the destruction. The rhetorical question deepens the sense of shock and disbelief, as though the speaker is questioning what he is saying. Try to make sense of a world that no longer follows the usual rules. Now, in this line, the phrase, "a woman with a child stand in my path, both naked." Here, the word naked is an example of symbolism because the nakedness of a woman and child can be seen as a symbol of the loss of privacy, security, and societal norms in the face of disaster and destruction. Their nakedness is not only physical but also symbolizes the raw, exposed state that people are left in after the disaster, devoid of the protections and the roles that they once had in society. Next, I turned my gaze but was at a loss that she should stand thus, till I came across a naked man. And now the thought arose that some strange thing had stripped us of our clothes. Now, in this line, the phrase, "I turned my gaze," is an example of imagery because it allows the reader to imagine the speaker physically moving their eyes to observe something. This is followed by a naked man, which creates a striking visual of someone exposed, therefore focusing on the vulnerability, right? So, the imagery of nakedness in this chaotic context amplifies or increases the feeling of helplessness, disorientation, and raw exposure. Now, in the same line, the description of the naked man and the feeling of being stripped of our clothes are examples of imagery because they create a vivid picture, making the scene feel real and tangible. Now, in this line, the repetition of the S sound in strange thing and stripped adds a flowing rhythm to the sentence. Therefore, it is an example of alliteration. Next, in the same line, the phrase, "some strange thing had stripped us of our clothes," is a metaphor, suggesting that something beyond their control has taken away their dignity or their normality, rather than just their clothing. Next, the face of an old woman on the ground was marred with suffering, but she made no sound. Silence was common to us all. I heard no cries of anguish or a single word. In this line, the phrase, "the face of an old woman on the ground," is an example of imagery because it paints a vivid image of a frail, helpless woman in a vulnerable position lying on the ground. Now, the reader can visualize the scene of devastation and suffering. The description "was marred with suffering" gives further detail, therefore helping us to imagine her painful, worn expression. Now, the repetition of the S sound in suffering and sound creates a soft, flowing sound that draws attention to the silence and stillness in the scene. That is why it is an example of alliteration. The sound of these words enhances the mood of quiet despair. Now, in this line, the contrast between marred with suffering and the fact that the woman makes no sound is striking. It highlights the difference between internal pain and the external silence, suggesting that the pain is so great it cannot even be expressed through sound. Okay, this intensifies the emotional weight of the scene. These lines, are examples of pathos because these lines evoke a deep sense of sorrow and compassion for the old woman and for everyone affected by the disaster. The silence adds to the emotional intensity as the reader can feel the profound sadness of a world where no one can even cry out in pain anymore. It also deepens the sense of loss and human fragility. Now, lastly, I would like to mention the stream of consciousness used by the poet throughout the poem. Haven't we all noticed that the speaker's thoughts come across as random and scattered, especially when he is upset? This technique shows how the speaker feels confused and troubled after the disaster. His broken thoughts reflect his emotional state as he tries to understand what has happened. Together, all these elements create an atmosphere of confusion, sadness, and emotional numbness. They make the reader feel the trauma, not just with their mind, but also with their emotions. The deep silence and vivid imagery leave a strong impact, showing the pain and helplessness people feel in such a terrible situation. That is all for now, everyone. I hope this helped. Bye.